Hi, everyone. Happy Friday and welcome to today's EWG Facebook Live. My name is Melanie Benish and I am the legislative attorney at the Environmental Working Group. I'm joined today by Alexis Guild, who is the Director of Health Policy and Programs at Farmworker Justice, and Jared Hayes, who is my colleague at EWG and is our policy analyst. And they're joining us today to discuss how farm workers are uniquely vulnerable to the impact of COVID-19 and also address what state governments are and aren't doing to protect this essential workforce. Towards the end of this broadcast, we will take some time to answer any questions you all might have. So please feel free to post your questions in the comment stream and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of this broadcast. And with that, I'd like to introduce Alexis Guild of Farmworker Justice. Farmworker Justice is a nonprofit organization that seeks to empower migrant and seasonal farm workers to improve their overall living and working conditions and access to justice. Alexis, can you tell us a little bit about why farm workers and farm worker communities are facing such high instances of COVID-19 right now and what factors there are that are making them so vulnerable?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. You know, there are a number of factors that make farm workers vulnerable to COVID-19. Just to name a few, certainly the conditions in the fields, as well as the homes and transportation. In the fields, they may lack access to hand washing stations, so they won't be able to wash their hands as often. They also often share bathroom and kitchen facilities. It's hard to social distance in the fields. Many of the work requires the crews working closely together. So being able to socially distance is quite difficult, and not only in the fields, but also transportation to and from the fields, as well as the housing. You know, even both employer and non-employer housing, and some farm workers live in employer housing and some live in their own housing in the communities, they tend to be overcrowded with multiple people, multiple families in one unit because of farm workers' low wages. There's also, I would say, a fear of employer retaliation. There's a stigma around COVID-19. We've heard of workers being fired if they test positive, if they are sick. They don't really know about their access to sick leave. So that makes farm workers fearful about taking that sick leave if they do test positive. We have also heard of employers who have told workers to go to work even if they test positive but are asymptomatic. There also is just a lack of access to healthcare, as well as a high incidence of diabetes, asthma, and other complications, conditions that make them more vulnerable to complications of COVID-19.
Thank you, Alexis. And Jared, along with EWG, Farmworker Justice has been working to track cases of farm workers who contract COVID-19, and the two organizations have been working together to map those cases. Can you tell us a little bit about that effort and what that's looked like?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. As you said, EWG and Farmworker Justice have been tracking COVID-19 cases among farm workers throughout the country. And we've been doing this through a publicly available map that we've made on our website, ewg.org, and which we'll link in the comment section here as well. And I can pull that up for you now. So as you can see, this map shows a heat map of where all the COVID-19 cases are nationally by county. And we've gone ahead and overlaid that on top of where we expect the most farm workers are throughout the country. It's because we wanted to see if there was a correlation between higher rates of COVID-19 and higher farm worker populations. And so to add context to that, we've gone ahead and added green dots throughout the map to show exactly where known locations of farm workers who have contracted the virus. In some of these instances, individual farms have had hundreds of cases alone. Now, unfortunately, the individual cases shown throughout the map here are just going to be the tip of the iceberg. We created this map because the federal government hasn't been tracking or reporting cases of COVID-19 by occupation. And that's led it up to us, amongst others, to gather news reports and reporting from some state and local governments to try to track the extent of this outbreak in these communities. Colorado, for instance, has been one of the best, and they've maintained a public database of outbreaks by business and occupation that has allowed for a much better understanding of case trends throughout the country. But so far, there have been over 4,600 documented cases of farm workers with COVID-19, and that number is steadily climbing as the months go on, and as these essential workers lack many of the needed workplace protections that would help mitigate the spread of this virus.
Wow, that's really terrifying. And it also brings up an important point. What kind of workplace protections would farm workers need to stop this kind of spread that seems to be so pervasive at this moment? Alexis, would you be able to go into that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. You know, workers really rely on employers to provide those protections because they have very little control over their work environment, and many have very little control over their living environment. One important protection would be providing personal protective equipment to the workers, including masks and gloves, so that when they touch tools, when they are in common spaces, they're able to protect themselves and others. Other protections that can be put in place include making sure that there's social distancing in the field and in transportation. That may mean having more vans to transport the workers, or perhaps having smaller crews of workers at certain times. Another really important protection is hand washing stations. So the field sanitation standard mandates that fields have to have a hand washing station within a quarter mile of workers, but that's still quite a distance. And enforcement is difficult. So sometimes the hand washing stations are a little bit further than that. And it takes time to walk, back and forth from where they are to the hand washing station, and then have time to actually wash your hands for 20 seconds as recommended by the CDC. So having more hand washing stations available, and also providing time to those workers so that they're able to go and wash their hands for 20 seconds is vital. Other really important protections would be education, not only about COVID-19 and its symptoms and how to protect themselves, but also on the availability of sick leave and what their rights are under the CARES Act and other regulations where states actually put forth regulations. What are those protections? What are their rights? And of course, access to testing, partnering with health centers or the health department, making sure that farm workers are getting tested, making sure that they have the means to go to the health center if they need to get tested. So there are a lot of different ways that employers can protect their workers. The challenge is that because of a lack of federal standards, there is a patchwork. And so in some states, there are regulations, but especially in states where there aren't regulations, where there's guidance, the protections put in place can really vary from farm to farm. So some workers may work for an employer who is putting in place all these protections, but then down the road, other workers can work for another employer where there are very few protections in place.
And what are states doing to address this issue and make sure that farm workers are protected, or what aren't states doing? Jared, could you help us understand what states are doing and what it means when a state issues a set of standards versus when a state issues a set of guidances for an industry like farm working?
Yeah, sure. So the short answer to that is that standards are mandatory requirements that employers are legally obliged to follow, such as providing PPE for workers or mandating social distancing. The guidances, on the other hand, are recommendations to employers on what the best practices would be. And for those that there is no enforcement mechanism, and generally employers are not obliged in any way to follow them. The guidances end up leaving it up to employers, whether they choose to implement safe practices. And on top of that, under these guidances, employers are under no obligation to communicate the safety measures to their employees. And so that's created a patchwork of different practices that can be different from one farm to the next farm over. But then we have the mandatory standards, and those require employers to communicate to their workforces exactly what their rights are in terms of protections. Though it should be noted that in cases of mandatory requirements, there has been some limit to the oversight, partially due to state agriculture departments not having the field staff available due to COVID-19.
Thank you so much for that. For those of you who are just joining us, this is a Facebook Live with Alexis Guild, Director of Health Policy and Programs at Farmworker Justice, and Jared Hayes, who is a policy analyst at the Environmental Working Group. And they're both here today to discuss what's being done to protect farm workers during the COVID-19 crisis. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments section, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of this discussion. Moving on, in a recent report, EWG and Farmworker Justice worked together to compile and analyze all of the standards and guidances that states have been putting out to address farm worker protections. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Alexis said earlier, there have been many different programs that should exist to properly protect farm workers. We wanted to know exactly which programs have been put into place and in which states. So we felt that this was an important issue as migrant communities throughout the country are moving for harvest season. They're facing a patchwork of different protections, and there hasn't been an easy way to know what those protections are and what they're entitled to throughout the country. So we at EWG and Farmworker Justice have put together this helpful guide. Now, as you can see, we laid out on the left of the screen all the different practices that can be put into place throughout the country. And we've seen these in different places, such as Pennsylvania, that has mandatory requirements. But right now, there are only 9 states, including Washington, Oregon, New York, and Pennsylvania, that have all set mandatory standards that specifically address working conditions for farm workers. Now, that group of states will grow to 10 as Virginia's mandatory standard goes into effect next Monday, July 27th. But not all those standards have the exact same standards, however. For example, some states have requirements around social distancing, but other states don't address it at all, and other states have housing and transportation and its recommendations in different places. And so that's a small patchwork, and we've provided this so people can know exactly what they're looking at, where they are. But for the rest of the states, 18 of the states only have guidances to protect farm workers, and that's why I've said the effectiveness of guidances is limited. But then the rest, almost half of all states, have no guidances, no standards whatsoever. And this patchwork has created quite a bit of confusion, and without any federal standards, we're unlikely to see any consistency throughout the states at all.
Wow, that's a really helpful visual and really helpful breakdown of the state guidances and standards, but certainly seems insufficient to protect most farm workers who, of course, are not just in those states, but are all over those countries. And so you mentioned the need for a federal government response. And I'm wondering on that topic, Alexis, if you could tell us about what OSHA and the CDC have been doing to address farm worker issues in response to COVID, if anything.
So OSHA and CDC published guidance in early June, and it's guidance for agricultural employers. In the guidance, they encourage employers to develop a COVID assessment and control plan, including screening and monitoring of workers, sanitation, physical distancing, and the provision of protective equipment. The issue, as Jared discussed, is that this is guidance. It's not mandatory, it's not enforceable. Employers can choose to follow it or not, just like other CDC guidance. So what we really need is a federal standard, and we need OSHA to put forth an emergency temporary standard to protect essential workers like farm workers who are out there risking their lives to ensure that we have fruits and vegetables on our tables.
Thank you. And what about Congress? Congress has been passing a number of different COVID-19 relief bills. Are there any protections for farm workers in any of those bills?
Some, but there's certainly nowhere near what's needed. So it said that the Senate will release their latest COVID-19 relief bill next week. And in that, there's going to be another $19 billion in payments to farm owners. But unfortunately, there's been no requirement to protect farm workers and no requirement that these farm owners use any of that 19 billion to provide PPE or other basic protections to their employees, which is honestly pretty sickening that the Senate majority leadership won't be spending a single cent to actually protect the folks who are out there picking the food. But that is not to say that there hasn't been some light in Congress as well. Some great bills are out there. Senator Merkley of Oregon has introduced the Farm Laborers Protection Act, and that's meant to provide assistance to agricultural workers to help fight the spread of COVID-19. This bill includes higher pay, sick leave, job protection to prevent employees from being fired when they become symptomatic. And importantly, it would make some of the CDC guidelines for agricultural employees mandatory. That would finally create some national protections. And all of this would include an enforcement mechanism that would help ensure that employers are carrying out these practices. Another piece of legislation has been introduced by Representative Panetta of California, and his amendment to the annual spending bill this year will provide $500 million to make sure that food and farm workers have personal protective equipment while on the job. That amount will go such a far way to help these communities avoid the spread of the virus. So there are some good things going on Capitol Hill right now. Yeah.
Thank you. So it sounds like not enough in any of the bills that have passed so far, but that there are some good proposals out there. So we are going to take a couple of questions or offer a couple of questions that we've received to our two guests. As we just noticed, as we just discussed, Congress has done a few things, hasn't done nearly enough. States have done a few things, not nearly enough. And so while we were waiting for the government to take action, are there groups around the country that are helping farm workers at this time? And what kind of things are they working on? Alexis, could you answer that question?
Yeah, there are a lot of groups who are, out there really trying to either educate workers about their rights or about how to protect themselves from COVID or where to seek testing and treatment. Community health centers, migrant health centers specifically, who are health centers who actually serve farm workers and farm worker communities. There are community-based organizations who are providing information to workers, not only in English, but also in Spanish and indigenous languages and other languages spoken by farm workers. There also are many groups, both at the local level, state level, national level, who are coming together to make sure that workers have the protection they need, including masks. Farmworker Justice is one of those organizations. We have been working with a group of volunteer mask makers, and we've been connecting them to community-based organizations so that we can get masks out to workers, because as I mentioned, many employers are not providing masks to their workers, and so and they need masks. So we are part of that effort, but there are a lot of organizations who are really trying to fill in that gap.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for the work that you and other groups are doing, particularly while the government is not doing enough and there's a real crisis happening out there. So we really appreciate the work that Farmworker Justice is doing and all the other migrant groups around the country. Jared, you have put a lot of work into tracking COVID cases and outbreaks in farm working communities. Is anyone else tracking this kind of information?
Well, we certainly wish that the government was doing it. We would have much better information than just trying to find it ourselves. But there are some other folks who are doing some reporting on that. The Food Environment Reporting Network has been doing some great work to track the spread among food and farm worker communities, especially at meatpacking plants and food packing plants. They have been tracking over 46,000 cases across the country. But it's unfortunate that it's up to nonprofits and news organizations to track the spread of this and bring attention to it. And as we've seen at meatpacking plants, these outbreaks can cause major disruptions to the food supply chain, and the government ought to be tracking this information in a more meaningful way to fully protect these communities.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. And if anyone out there is listening and interested in this, and you're not already covering the Food and Environment Reporting Network or FERN's coverage on this, I definitely encourage you to follow them and read their work, because they certainly are doing a great job tracking outbreaks in farm working communities, as well as meatpacking plants and other food supply organizations. One more question: can COVID be transmitted by food?
So there hasn't been any evidence at this point to suggest that the virus can be transmitted by food. And so people should feel safe still going out and buying food at the grocery store. And the folks picking it are, we're trying to get them that protection.
Well, I think that's all of the questions that we have. Jared or Alexis, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to leave the viewers of our Facebook Live with?
Well, first of all, again, I want to thank you for inviting us to participate in this Facebook Live event today. I would also encourage our viewers to check out both EWG's website and Farmworker Justice's website for more information, not only on COVID, but also the other social determinants of health that really impact farm workers and their well-being. We are working together. We are trying to advocate for workers. They are essential. They are so proud of the work that they do. They take a lot of pride in being out in the field, and they deserve to have the respect and dignity that they have in their work, and they deserve that from our federal government and our state government. So please keep looking at our websites, keep up on the media, and we all can make a difference.
Jared, anything to add?
Just that we're hoping that we can actually see some major changes in the coming months, that we can get these protections out to these vital employees who are working so hard throughout the country.
Well, thank you so much to Alexis Gill, Director of Health Policy and Programs at Farmworker Justice, and to Jared Hayes, Policy Analyst at the Environmental Working Group, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise. And thank you for all of the work that you do. And thank you to all of our followers for tuning in.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.